Liz Truss was described by people acting regally, like a queen. And I think she's a classic case of it. You just get out of control. Power goes to your head. And we need to be aware of it. It occurs in all walks of life.
Hello, this is Matt Chorley from Times Radio. Today I'm joined by David Owen, Lord Owen, former Foreign Secretary, former leader of the SDP, and author of the hugely timely book, Riddle, Mystery and Enigma, 200 Years of British-Russian Relations. Let's take a look now at your political career. I was looking up some of your CV. Your first political meeting was to hear Aneurin Bevan speaking on behalf of Michael Foot in Plymouth in 1950.
Yes. And I was standing there with my grandfather, who was a clergyman in the Church of Wales, blind from the age of 11. And the dockyard mateys looked at my father and him and said, he can't see anything. Why don't we carry him over our heads and take him to the front? And they did exactly that. I went right to the front, being carried over their heads, and left my father and my grandfather. My grandfather wanted Aneurin Bevan to be Prime Minister.
And is that where you got the political bug?
I suppose so. I used to think that nobody was very much involved in politics in my family. It was a tremendous area. Well, my mother was a genuine independent on Devon County Council for 25 years and an alderman. But actually, when I look back over my Welsh family, one of my great-grandfathers on the Llewellyn side was chairman of Glamorganshire County Council as a Liberal for 25 years. So I've got a long pedigree, but I was quite unaware of it.
There's politics in your blood. So it was 16 years later, you first stood in Plymouth for Labour in 1966. You were up against Betty Boothroyd to become the candidate.
For the candidate. Yeah. And afterwards, the women came to me and they said, Betty Boothroyd made a much better speech than you did. And I said, well, why do you vote for me? Oh, we're patients of your father. My father was a GP in Plymouth. Yeah, so I owe it all to him.
That's what swung it. And you were a doctor before as well.
I was a serious doctor. In fact, I still am. You can be as rude as you like to me about my politics, but you can't be rude to me about my medical career. And I'm very proud of doing over 2.5 years of serious research into the chemistry of the brain with one of the most brilliant researchers, David Marsden. I think working alongside him must have somehow, but I never really decided to go and become an MP. Even when I fought in Plymouth Sutton in 1966, I never thought I was going to win. The previous Labour candidate, John Dunwoody, had given it up and was standing in Falmouth and Campbell. In fact, I was shortlisted for that. It was far too far away. I was unmarried, and it was easier to be a candidate as in Plymouth. So it's my home city. Yeah. You know, I am a Plymouthian, born and bred. I'm the longest-serving MP in its history.
When did you realise you were a politician instead of, or as well as being a doctor? Did you ever think, I'm not a doctor right now?
Well, I think I can actually relate to it. I didn't take any political position. I didn't join any party at Cambridge, although I was very actively involved. And we just had the Suez crisis and then the invasion of Hungary. And I was very active. And I took a lot of interest in the debates about politics, whether they were in the then Great St. Mary's Church or whether it was in I forgot now the name of it. It was a grouping of people debating issues under E.M. Forster. But I came back to St. Thomas's. It was 1959. I'd voted for Hugh Gaitskell. It was very sad that he didn't become the Prime Minister. And I heard him say on the radio, there are too many armchair politicians. And I thought, that's me. So I'll join the Labour Party. It took me nearly 3 weeks around Lambeth before the Labour Party was actually open to join. But I joined and I never regretted it.
And quite a rise. I mean, it's interesting you say about debating foreign affairs, especially when you're at Cambridge, because then at the age of only 38, you became Foreign Secretary in 1977. 38 is very young to be Foreign Secretary.
Yes, and it was tricky problems I had. They were mainly in Africa. And I had never been to Africa. So the first thing to do, apart from going to meet President Carter with Jim Callaghan in Washington, was to get on a policy. And I was the architect, really, of the American British initiative over Africa. I took a view that we would not be able to deal with all the problems. South Africa, of course, southern Rhodesia being the big issue, but also problems with Cubans in Angola and elsewhere without the clout of America. And I worked very closely with Cyrus Vance, who was the US Secretary of State, and Carter himself was very keen on Africa and dealing with apartheid. And so it was a constructive period and very active period. And we had great successes, there's no doubt about that. We passed the first UN resolution allowing to consider what was happening in South Africa and in Rhodesia as a threat to the peace. And we were then able to use sanctions.
And how do you, as a 38-year-old, people listening to this either are 38 or remember they're 38, in your 30s, suddenly going into, I don't know, the boss's office is quite an intimidating thing. Being 38 and going into the White House or going into the governments of foreign countries, how do you cope with that? Did you have supreme self-confidence?
I think medicine does help you, you know. When you first qualify, I was just 23, and I was making decisions of life and death, straight out as a house physician, a house surgeon. And I think you mature pretty rapidly. Medical students are well known for being wild, and I had my wild period, but you suddenly wake up when you're a qualified doctor, and I think it's a very quick growth in your personality and your seriousness, and you have to take decisions quickly. You have to weigh up conflicting evidence, not too different from being Foreign Secretary, really.
Was there anyone you were particularly intimidated by during that period?
Not really. I was amazed how Jimmy Carter, because he was interested, would chair meetings that would normally have in the State Department with Cy Vance. He was there in the chair, and I would be opposite him. He took no side. He didn't feel the Prime Minister had to be there. You know, he was quite happy for me to lead our delegation and to discuss policy and argue it through. So I had a lot of respect for Carter, and still do, I may say. I don't join in all the criticism of him. I think he started serious human rights policies and serious issues in Africa. Previously, everybody was talking about weighted votings and A rolls and B rolls. I said straight out, that's all over. This is going to be one person, one vote.
When you were this sort of high-flying foreign secretary, there was lots of talk. You were a good-looking, glamorous politician. You were a film star. I think it was Matinee Idol people talked about. You seem destined.
That's a bit far.
I'm allowed to say that, even if you're obliged to disagree. You seem destined to become Prime Minister. Did you think that was a trajectory that you were on?
For a very short time, I did. I can remember when I ceased to be dominated by it. There was a terrific demand to hold a Lancaster House conference on the constitutional question of Rhodesia, and I wanted it, and the Prime Minister wanted it. And two older men came to see me, very distinguished people. One had been the former Chief of Defense, Mike Carver, and the other was a very senior diplomat. And they said to me, you always said you'd never hold the Lancaster House conference until you knew it would be a success. They didn't need to then say, you know, it won't be a success. And I said, let me think about it. I thought about it and stood looking out at St. James's Park, and I then set out to convince, firstly, Jim Callaghan that the time was not right and that we had to wait. And eventually that Lancaster House conference came under Peter Carrington a little over a year later, and that was the right time for it. And we'd always known we had to go to Lusaka first and get it sorted. And I consider that was a decision which made me realize that I was not essential that I became Prime Minister. That stage, as a young Foreign Secretary, I knew your main job was to do what was right. And sometimes that doesn't. And leaving Labour also, of course, made it clear that I wouldn't do it. I left the Labour Party, clearly very differently for most of the others, and particularly the Gang of Four. I left Labour because I believed they had to get rid of the left, get rid of them. Corbyn's continued existence showed that Blair never got rid of the left, and you have got to deal with this problem of the left. And I have not much time for people who compromise with Corbyn. He was definitely, and his other chief sidekick, they were trots. They were people on far left. We knew what they were, and they were there still after all those years, for goodness sake. And until that happens in the Labour Party, there'll always be a question mark over them. I thought it was best to have a group outside the party and a group inside, and Roy Hattersley and I differed on that at the time. Now we're good friends, and you had to have both. You had to have the fight inside the party and show people you could have a party on the outside also determined to do the same. But we got into bed with the Liberals. And as soon as we got to bed with the Liberals, we lost our, essential, crucial point to our existence was we were a new party. And gradually that image of us being eroded with alliance and sharing seats and everything like changed. I was ready to fight to build a party, and it was probably going to take 10 or 15 years before it became the government of the country, and probably wouldn't have had me as Prime Minister even by then.
It's interesting when you sort of look, we talk about Lancaster House and the big, summits and events that happen to sort of go down in history. You're probably one of the few politicians whose own house has secured its place in history. Limehouse, the Limehouse Declaration.
Yes, my wife typed it. She's very proud.
Explain.
She says she's still the only SDP member. Still there. A lot of women came into the SDP. I think we did one really big change for British politics. A lot of women came for the first time into political engagement. Now you see them and they often talk to me. They're conservative, liberal, or whatever.
Explain how it happened. Why was it the Limehouse Declaration?
Complete accident. It could well have been in Bill Rogers' house 2 days before. But we decided to wait until after the conference decision, which gave the power of the trade union to choose the Prime Minister of the country. And I think that in retrospect, we had a recent very interesting event in the election of Liz Truss. And the answer is you need to make either the general public in an election choose a Prime Minister or the MPs who know them. And we should not go on with this half-ass solution of party members actually being able to choose. They very often make the wrong choice, and there's very clear and obvious fact. They should never have chosen Liz Truss.
And the same is true of Jeremy Corbyn.
Of course. It goes on inside the Lib Party. And they haven't really changed the system. What I think they should do now is Labour and Conservative and Liberal MPs to make this change, that if you have a vacancy for a Prime Minister in the middle of a parliament, then it's the MPs. And all do it, and all scrap it. It's not worked. If you need any question about it, just look at Liz Truss. Prime Minister, for somebody said rather unkindly, if you took out all the days of what was happening with the death of the Queen and everything like that, they said 13 days, the lifetime of Alexis. And here she is drawing extra money as Prime Minister, attending. It's absurd. She's hardly there for a day or more. There's some big lessons, constitutional lessons, of what has happened over the last few months. And I don't expect the Parliament will get to grips with it. It's high time they did.
You talked about your medical study of. Let's talk about your hubris syndrome theory, and explain first of all what it is and who you think of the prime ministers you've come across.
Well, it's a Greek word, and it's when people get above themselves. It's when they get on a high, or people understand it, And I chose the Greek word because I didn't want to say they're not mad. It's not a mental illness in that sense, nor are they deranged. And they exist in lots of walks of life. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, said Lord Acton. It's been known about for a long time, and I think we're pretty close now, the neuroscientists of today, to getting a pharmacological and neuroscientific explanation of it, that under the stress of office, big office, these people tend to get carried away, and they think they are. Liz Truss was described by people acting regally, like a queen. And I think she's a classic case of it. You just get out of control. Power goes to your head. And we need to be aware of it. It occurs in all walks of life. It's in business probably even more than in politics. And I have written a lot of serious research in articles, Brain and elsewhere. We created a Daedalus Trust to examine it, and I helped put quite a lot of money in to get research done. A lot of books have been written about it now, but still politicians ignore it, and they don't look for it.
Is there something about politics that attracts the sort of people who have? Is that the problem?
Of course, yeah. But that's the same in business.
Yeah.
People who like to lead, and armed services too, and without a certain readiness to take decisions and to live with the consequences and sometimes making mistakes. But it's the level of mistakes, I mean, it is unbelievable, really, still, that somebody like Liz Truss could have believed, with all the massive debts this country has, that we could go and ask people to lend us more money when we were going to give tax concessions to the rich. Somebody wrote the other day, the last time we did that was 50 years ago. That must be 1973 under Ted Heath. If you're broke, you have to be aware of the fact people want some good reasons to go on investing in you. And if they see you acting in a slapdash, cocky, insensitive way, they'll withdraw their money, and that's what happened. So we are now in the position where international confidence is rather fragile, and this government is dealing with that, and it's getting better, and thank goodness. But they also are responsible for what was done. After all, they were elected Truss, not the MPs, and the party.
Given the number of foreign ministers you've seen, particularly up close, Callaghan, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, Johnson, I'm just trying to remember them all, Johnson, Truss, have they all had hubris?
Oh, no. Callaghan didn't have hubris. John Major doesn't have hubris. I've just chosen two people who clearly didn't have it. Clem Attlee never had hubris. And I think it's very little sign that our present Prime Minister has hubris. I don't think so. And so I think that it's a rare issue, and it usually comes out, as I say, on a background of being in power for a while. And if we're right, the stress is the fundamental thing, then it possibly takes a little time before that stress manifests itself in, if you like, a pharmacological change in the brain. We shouldn't be too upset about that. As after all, our brains are a pretty remarkable feature anyhow, that they may have a little bit extra chemicals under some circumstances like stress. It's pretty obvious.
It's a good case for having term limits. Actually, if we look at, particularly, I suppose, Thatcher and Blair, the most obvious ones to look at, clearly by the end they went on and on and on to the point of... if
They developed hubris towards the end. The Thatcherites find this very hard to understand. But, she was thrown out by her cabinet, and she definitely, only in the latter years, actually, I don't think she had it very early on. More, I would say, the last 2 years it started to develop, and Blair didn't have it initially. I think it started after his first victory. I think his first period in office, first 4 years, were excellent, and I've got no complaints at all. But the decision on Iraq put him under great strain, and he was putting British soldiers' lives at risk, perfectly understandable. And I think he started to believe himself. And I once had dinner with him, and just the four of us with wives in the middle of the crisis. And I said to him, "Are you sure they're nuclear weapons? After all, we've taken them away once from Iraq. And the UN went in, found them, and got rid of them. Are you sure they are?" He was talking to me on Privy Council terms. I know now what intelligence he had at the same time. It was absurd to pretend on that rather skimpy intelligence that there were nuclear weapons. Certainly not to go to war for them.
But he was still sure. He felt sure.
He was absolutely certain. Yeah. You couldn't shake him. And, it's a tragedy, really. I mean, he had many, many talents. As I say, had a very, very good first term. Started to go wrong, actually. Some of his reforms of the National Health Service were quite ridiculous, and we're living with the dangers of them now. So he was off on his feeling he had to do things, something like that. Once you find that restless energy, hubris is not very far away.
Let me take you back to Limehouse. Tell me who was in the room. Who was in this extraordinary moment? Also, remember, it wasn't. I mean, you know this.
Well, no, it wasn't.
Not.
It was a gang of four.
Yeah.
That was myself, Bill Rogers, Shirley Williams, and Roy Jenkins, and my wife. With the rest of them, we pushed away, but they came in later, the assistants and everybody like that. So it was just the four of us, really. We got pretty close, as I say, at a meeting at Bill's, which could have used a declaration, but didn't. And then, so it was an accident, really, and one I'm rather proud of, but I have no real reason to. It was just my turn to have the next meeting.
And how did you mark it? Was there cups of tea or champagne, or do you feel like you're in the middle of an historic moment?
We didn't have a drink, I don't think. I mean, the most interesting part of it was Shirley was unhappy about some of the wording, and so she said, "Oh, I'm on the 1 o'clock news." So we turned on the 1 o'clock news around this round table in our kitchen, and there was Shirley, positive as hell, as she often was. Give her a microphone and all those things, and we all started to laugh. And she agreed. She laughed too. We said, "If what you said, Shirley, our wording is mild in comparison." But just said on the world at what, and so we laughed, and she gave up her reservations, and so we went with it. I mean, it was perfectly clear to many of us that we would end up with a new party. What was not clear was we'd end up immediately almost in an alliance with the Liberals. And that was the problem of Roy Jenkins. We've got to be honest about it. He was a Liberal by then. And we, the three of us, started off as a gang of three. If we'd launched it as a gang of three, we would never have made that deep, deep-seated mistake of confusing people about what we were by sort of being in bed with the Liberals. All the evidence, and we took a lot of polling evidence, so all the advice was, whatever you do, don't lose the image of being a new party, because people are fed up with the old party.
And actually there were parallels with what happened with the independent group when the Labour MPs left under Jeremy Corbyn. Then they brought in Tory MPs, and it sort of muddied the waters as to what it was all about.
Subri and others. Yes, of course, they tarnished the image immediately. I think it was a great shame, because some of those were very able people. Whether that was quite the same public disgust with the Labour Party, it was pretty strong both times. All the time because of the left. And even now, the so-called moderates in the Labour Party better face up to it. They're going to have trouble. I mean, look at it now with these strikes. They can't face up to the fact that we haven't got the money to pay out. That's the problem. Now, I can argue about when it should be as soon as possible for the nurses, obviously, and many other people. People's disposable income has been reduced for a long period of time. And David Cameron and Osborne are very largely responsible for the austerity, the steady reduction in living standards. But at this moment, we have got to keep international confidence. It's as simple as that. And going on spending money outside the normal yearly settlements and destroying the pay boards, you could make sensible changes in the pay boards. They're good things, but they've lost their independence. They're called independent, but it's perfectly clear that successive governments have chipped away on that independence. And to have the trust back in that system, you've got to appoint people who are known to be independent and will be prepared to advise a pay rise that the government might not like. Well, then they've got to fight against the pay board. But don't neuter the pay board and get them to be your servants, and then talk about its independence. And we've done that, and that's been going on for about 15 years.
Do you think Keir Starmer's got what it takes to do that?
I don't know. That's up to everybody in the Labour Party to decide. I'm not a member of the Labour Party, and I'm not even allowed to vote. So I tend to stay out now of the party politics and choosing. If Sunak does something sensible, I'll support it. If Starmer says something sensible, I think it's a very good thing, for example, that both Starmer and Sunak have said they're not going to go back into the EU. Can you imagine anything more ridiculous than a parliament that voted for a referendum, then spent 3 years trying to get rid of the of the result of the referendum? I've never felt more angry or disgusted by Parliament that couldn't live with the referendum result. The idea of going now into another referendum, we have to focus now on one thing: economic growth and prosperity, and reducing our massive debts. We've been lying to the world about our debts. Our debts are much greater than people will face up to, and the responsibility for that is Labour and Conservative.
It's I noticed it's 40 years this year since you became leader of the SDP. And I wondered at what point you went from the optimism of the Limehouse Declaration around your kitchen table to realising this wasn't going according to the plan that you'd hoped for.
Well, I knew by the time I became leader that I was saddled with an alliance. We fought an alliance. It was very difficult to do it. Actually, I have no problems with David Steele. He wanted to be a liberal, and I wanted to be a social democrat. And both of us were confined almost by what had happened before. Anyhow, so you're crying over, so, well, all I would say, if anybody's ever thinking of forming a party again, don't land yourself immediately almost into bed with another political party. Fight for your party and fight for it on principles, and therefore be very wary about having people sort of every form of party. We were social democrats. I remain a social democrat. I am quite proud of being on the left. And I am fighting for the NHS at this moment. And I wish a lot more people would. The idea that you should give up the structure of the national health. My father was a general practitioner. When the NHS was created, it was a day of freedom. He didn't have to ask for anybody to pay anything. The one people who wouldn't were gypsies. They didn't believe they'd had a consultation unless silver passed the hat. So my father would say, okay, give me half a crown. And people should be, somebody now should write the social history of the 20s and the 30s and see what the disastrous healthcare was. My father used to be ashamed of it. Now he would be outraged and upset to know that we were even contemplating getting rid of the NHS. And that's what a lot of all this, charging here and charging there and all this sort of stuff. Look at the German system. Look at the German system. It's in serious trouble. Look at the French system. It too is in serious trouble. All governments have not spent enough on the healthcare. I am very clear that you should have a hypothecated health tax, and people should know that what you put into it is going just to help. And pensioners should pay for it too. We protect pensioners very considerably. I'm 84. A lot of my friends, and not very wealthy friends, want as pensioners to be able to help the National Health Service. They use it more than anybody else. And I think you'd find there would be a new tax group of rich pensioners who would prefer to be taxed if they knew the money was just going to healthcare. Hypothecate.
You talk about being a social democrat. Do you think Keir Starmer is a social democrat?
Oh, I think he definitely is. Yes, I'm always rather against questioning people's political allegiance if they join a political party and they do that. And I think he couldn't join a political party while he was director of public prosecutor. I think he's a man of distinction, and they were lucky to have somebody like that. The people I'm also particularly pleased to Labour at the moment is Rachel Reeves. She never took office under Corbyn. That took guts. She's got guts and intelligence. And I think if Labour comes into power, it would be a massive help to have a woman who worked in the Bank of England understands the complexities of our debt and all the problems, intricate problems of international affairs. She could hold international confidence in the same way that Jeremy Hunt and Sunak are doing at the moment. So I think it's a great help for Labour to have somebody who is very well qualified to do the job, has a record of courage, and will, in my view, if she was to become Chancellor, be very good.
Do you think it's possible for a proper Social Democrat to win in Britain? Or do you have to compromise with the electorate in order to get to Downing Street?
Politics is the art of compromise, so you can't be, if you're a Social Democrat, you can't be against compromise. It's built into its ethics, its ethos. You are, after all, trying to do the right thing, but get enough votes to be in a position to do it. And that means you have to listen to people. But I don't think compromise is a dirty word. I don't understand it. And it's the lifeblood of democratic politics, whether you're on the Conservative or not, or Labour. And good Conservatives have the same qualities. You know, I always think that Margaret Thatcher was often most underestimated by her own party. She was much more realistic than they were, much readier to compromise. She had this language, the Iron Lady. Take the miners' strike. Well, that was first coming under Joe Gormley. She told her energy secretary, pay up. She built up the reserves. She could see Arthur Scargill in the skies, and she got ready for a serious strike. And she won it because she had a coal reserve. Now, that's serious, pragmatic thinking. She was in many ways a pragmatist. She had other faults and other strengths, but sometimes your faults and your strengths go together.
She was a big fan of yours. At one point she said you were wasting your life.
Well, she said to my wife, why doesn't it, in number 10? And Debbie turned to her and said, Margaret, why don't you speak to David? He's here beside me.
So what, she said that to...
She said it to my wife.
While you were still...
Why doesn't David join the Conservative Party? There was never the slightest possibility that I would ever join the Conservative Party. I came into politics from the left, watching the housing very close around here at St. Thomas's. Those days, Lambeth, and deeper into Lambeth, housing was dreadful. I remember delivering a baby in a house in which the woman was in the bed and the bed went up to the window. I had to sit on the windowsill, lifting the window to put my posterior out through the window so I could catch the baby like that. Now, when I was admitting from the Royal Waterloo Hospital children into the children's ward, the first job I had, a wonderful job, I was admitting them off the street. The questions I was asking the people, what are the housing conditions? And time after time, you were bringing them in because there was no inside lavatory and no running hot water or gross overcrowding. And that's what made me a socialist. That's what made me really committed to socialism, was that you needed to change politically. We'd had 13 long, weary years of Tory misrule. The first place, of course, I stood while I was a doctor, I couldn't possibly win, Torrington, North Devon. Yeah. We used to call Appledore the Gibraltar, a solid Tory. And all I could do was save my deposit. And I did save my deposit. And the Tories cheered when my little pile got higher. And the Liberals booed. Some people say that's why I view the Liberals.
So you don't agree with Margaret Thatcher's assessment? You didn't waste your life?
I don't think I've wasted my life in any way at all. I've had a very happy life, and I haven't always made the right decisions, haven't always done the right things. I've 3 children, 4 grandchildren, and, I can't complain at all. I've had I was in business for a long time in Russia, incidentally. I then took, if you're going to business late, go where others fear to tread. And for a while, with Yeltsin there, it was a very exciting period, and I thought Russia could make it. We didn't help Yeltsin enough. He was a brave man, and we could have done a lot more. America in particular walked away, and we should have. What they brought to Russia was corruption in big business, and we didn't bring enough sensible investment and wise money. But there we are. We'll have to try again once Mr. Putin leaves.
What's your personal? Well, there's obviously lots of political regrets and what Britain hasn't done. Do you have any regrets on your career?
Oh yes, I regret that I couldn't rescue the SDP. I tried very hard, but I knew it would be very difficult. I just think, I think you have to change in life. I mean, I used to believe very strongly in Europe, and I still do for them. I just don't think it suited Britain.
Which is why you backed leave.
And I backed leave after a lot of hard thinking, and I felt that it was the right time to go and to retain control of our lives and our country. And that was Hugh Gaitskell who said, 1,000 years of history. And we have got too long a history to be put into a decision-making of now over 30 countries. You look at that, Sam, you can't govern. We each are answerable for our own government. If Europe was going to succeed, 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 of the bigger countries should become a country called Europe. I don't want that, but I think that's the right thing for them to do. You can't make decisions in a structure as large as that. And now you have a government in this country, and before, I mean, Boris Johnson deserves a lot of praise for the handling of Ukraine. He saw the dangers, he made the decisions. We were helping them even before the war started, and I think that's good. And I'm sure if we'd had a Labour government at that time, whoever had been the Labour leader would have done the same. And on these big issues, NATO, terrific success. How many people disparage? Macron talked about only 3 years ago that NATO was brain dead. It's made the most amazing adaptation of a long-standing defense organization, and we have to be careful. We will not cross the line to World War III. We are not going in to fight Russia in Ukraine. It's not cowardice, it's just simply foolish. The Ukrainians want to fight. We're entitled to help them fight, but not by being there as being part of it. This is not our war, and we can encourage them to negotiate perhaps a little earlier than they're ready to, and I would certainly do that. Don't always leave it to them. They need help, and that help is with weapons and ammunition, and also with political sense. I spent 2.5 years of my life as the EU negotiator in the Balkans. Now you see these characters, you understand what incredibly difficult it was just to get them in the same room as each other. But peacemaking is still quite rightly viewed as a very, very high priority, and we have never forget it, even in the midst of war.
Ending where we began then, all the way back to 1950, you first got the taste of politics. You call yourself a social democrat. You don't have a vote, obviously, because you are in the House of Lords. If you did have a vote, how do you think you'd vote in the next election?
I'm not going to tell you, because I don't have to vote. Therefore, why spend my time? I would prefer to feel, I'm quite open about it, I would prefer to feel that people can read what I say or hear what I do, and I'd still write a bit, and have written a long thing about the British economy at the moment, which will come out in a few weeks' time, that people might listen to it from the Tories, Liberals, or Labour easier if they don't know that I'm going to vote for X or Y. So I'm not going to go into the next election, well, at the moment, telling people how to vote. My feeling is that I've done enough of that. Yeah. I might have a vote amongst my grandchildren.
Yes. Very good. Lord Owen, David Owen, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time on Times Radio.